The blood on his shirt was already spreading when Fern pressed her palm against his ribs, and Radovan Kael didn't flinch. She could feel his breath, slow and deliberate, obscenely controlled for a man who'd just taken a bullet graze and walked through a burning corridor to get to her. The back office of the Harbourfront Club smelled of gunpowder and spilled scotch, and somewhere above them, Fern could still hear the muffled thud of boots on marble. "I told you to stay in the car," Kael said, not angry, just flat the way he said most things. "You were bleeding." Fern kept her hands moving. The wound was shallow, luck or skill she couldn't tell with him, but the angle worried her. Too close to the floating rib. "I'm a nurse. This is what I do." He looked down at her. His right arm was braced close against his side, the way it always was when he wasn't performing normalcy for an audience. His left hand was the one that had found her in the dark and pulled firmly and kept her low for 11 minutes while his men cleared the floor above them. "You do this," he said quietly, "because you choose to, not because your brother put you here." Fern didn't answer. The gauze from the first aid kit she'd grabbed off the wall caught, and she pressed it hard, and Radovan Kael, who made men confess things they'd carried for a decade with a single look, made a sound low in his throat and said nothing more. 4 months earlier, she hadn't known his name. Fern Westbrook had gone to the meeting because Derek asked her to, and she had said yes to Derek her entire life out of habit and some complicated residue of love that even 4 years of working ICU nights hadn't managed to burn out of her. She was 26 years old. She had a 12-hour shift starting at 7 the next morning. She had driven 40 minutes from her apartment in East Van to a building in Cole Harbour that had no logo on the door and a receptionist who looked like she could bench press a refrigerator. Derek's problem was 380,000. That was the number he'd given her on the phone. His voice dropping at the end like the figure embarrassed him more than the act itself. A bad investment, he'd said. A misunderstanding with some people he'd done business with. Derek's problem, it turned out, was Kael Industries, which was not an industry in any legal sense, but which controlled the movement of a significant portion of cargo through the port of Metro Vancouver, and which had recently discovered that Derek Westbrook had been skimming percentages off a distribution contract he had no authority to touch. Fern had sat across from a man named Bryce Holland, Kael's second-in-command, who had a smile that reminded her of the particular kind of doctor who delivers bad news while straightening his tie. He'd explained the situation with the cheerful precision of someone reading a lease agreement. "Mr. Kael is a reasonable man," Bryce had said. "He doesn't want your brother's hands. He wants what's owed. Derek doesn't have $380,000. We know." Then what? The door behind Bryce had opened, and Fern had felt the pressure in the room change before she even looked up. Radovan Kael was not what she'd expected. She'd spent the drive over constructing a mental image from every crime documentary she'd ever half-watched. Middle-aged, soft around the edges, chain-smoking in a room full of men who laughed too loudly at his jokes. What she got instead was a man in his early 40s with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and come out the other side looking like an argument you would lose. Dark eyes, a jaw that could cut glass, and his right arm. She clocked it immediately, the nurse in her taking inventory without permission, held at a careful angle in a slim graphite brace that ran from wrist to just above the elbow. The hand below it was still. The fingers didn't curl the way you'd expect. He sat across from her, didn't open a folder, didn't make a speech. "You're the nurse," he said. "I am. Fern Westbrook, St. Paul's Hospital, Trauma and Intensive Care." He paused. "Your brother has nothing to give me, but I have a use for you." She should have left. She knew, in the abstract way you know things that are inconvenient to act on, that she should have stood up and walked out and let Derek manage his own catastrophe for once in his adult life. But Kael had looked at her, not the way Bryce had looked at her, which was assessingly like she was a line item, and said, 3 months. You live on the property and serve as my private medic. Your brother's debt is cancelled. No one touches him. At the end of 90 days, you go back to your life. And if I say no, then I'm a less reasonable man." She stayed. The Kael estate sat in the West Vancouver hills above the city, the kind of house that had been designed to feel like a fortress while pretending to be a home. Glass and pale stone and views of the harbor that were beautiful in a way Fern never quite got used to. She had a room on the second floor that was larger than her entire apartment, and she spent the first 2 weeks waiting for something terrible to happen and being mildly frustrated when it didn't. Her job in practice was to be present, to monitor post-surgical blood work results that Kael's regular physicians delivered weekly, to manage his pain medications, complex because he refused anything that blunted his thinking, and the nerve damage in his arm produced a particular kind of deep, grinding ache that didn't respond to conventional dosing, and to stay out of his way, which was easier said than done in a house where he worked 18-hour days. The arm was the result of a car bomb. 8 months before she arrived, a device planted beneath his Range Rover had detonated, while he was still close enough that the blast threw him into a concrete pillar, shattering his elbow and destroying the radial nerve from the point of impact downward. His right hand had not fully functioned since. The rumors in the world he occupied, and Fern learned slowly that it was a very busy world, were that Kael was finished, that a man who couldn't use both hands couldn't lead, that the empire he'd built from the ground up over 15 years was now a question mark wrapped around a declining king. He was not declining. He was the most alarmingly present person Fern had ever encountered. She found out about the therapy by accident 3 weeks in. She'd been looking for the linen closet and opened the wrong door and found him in the ground floor physio room, alone, standing over a low table with a pen in his right hand. He was trying to sign his name. She could see the effort of it in his shoulders, the particular stillness of a person pushing against something that won't move. The pen slipped. He caught it with his left hand, set it down carefully and stared at the illegible mark on the paper for a long moment. Fern stepped back. She almost made it. "Don't," he said without turning around. She stopped. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to look at me with some version of a face." He turned then, and his expression was composed, which meant he'd had just enough time to make it that way. "I don't want the face." "I don't have a face. Everyone has a face." "What I have," Fern said carefully, "is a clinical observation. You're gripping too high on the barrel. The nerve damage starts at the elbow, so you've still got some proprioception in the proximal finger joints. If you choke up and use lateral pressure instead of vertical grip," she paused, "you might get something legible." He looked at her for a long moment, then he picked up the pen. She was right. The signature wasn't pretty, but it was his. He didn't thank her. He nodded, once, and she left, but after that, when she passed the physio room in the mornings, the door was sometimes open. The Harbourfront Charity Gala was the city's annual performance of civility. The one evening per year when Vancouver's legitimate money and its less legitimate money stood in the same ballroom and pretended the distinction was academic. Kael attended because not attending was a statement he wasn't ready to make. Fern attended because Bryce Holland had told her pleasantly that her presence was expected. She wore a dark green dress that belonged to no version of herself she recognized, and stood beside Kael in the grand room of the Pacific Rim Hotel, while the city's best-dressed sharks circled and tried not to stare at his arm. They stared anyway. That was the thing about power in decline. Everyone watched for the moment the ground gave way, so they could say they'd seen it coming. Emilian Vascu found them near the bar. He was a broad, silver-haired man with a cargo operation out of Prince Rupert and a reputation for acquiring other people's problems when they were sufficiently weakened to be acquired. He shook Kael's left hand pointedly and then let his gaze travel to Fern with the particular form of rudeness that disguises itself as appreciation. Raddy smiled. "Good to see you out. We'd heard you were resting." "I was in Edmonton last week," Kael said pleasantly, "and Calgary the week before. I find resting expensive." Vascu's smile tightened. His eyes dropped to the brace on Kael's right arm. Still, it must be a considerable adjustment. Managing things with, he gestured vaguely, limitations. The word landed in the air between them like something dropped from a height. Fern heard it. She felt it the way you feel a change in cabin pressure, a subtle wrongness, a tightening in the chest. She watched Kael's jaw go still and looked sideways at Bryce Holland, standing 3 feet away with a glass of red wine, already looking elsewhere, not stepping in, not even trying. She stepped forward. "Mr. Vascu." Her voice came out cleaner than she felt. "I work in intensive care. I've watched people run a ward, manage staff and make life or death calls in under 30 seconds with a concussion, a broken wrist, and 4 hours of sleep behind them. Capability lives in the mind, not the limb." She tilted her head. "I imagine you know that. Or perhaps not, given how much time you seem to spend looking at Mr. Kael's arm rather than his quarterly returns." The silence around them expanded like a held breath. Vascu's face went an ugly, careful red. Bryce had gone very still. Kael looked at her. She couldn't fully read his expression. It was doing something complicated in the region of surprise, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. Then he turned back to Vascu with the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "You'll have to excuse my medic," he said. "She has very little patience for imprecision." Vascu left without making a speech about it. Bryce materialized at Kael's shoulder, voice low and controlled. "That was unnecessary. You can't afford to antagonize Vascu right now. He has 3 votes in the consortium review next month." "She spoke the truth," Kael said. "Get me another drink." The lights went out at 10:47. Fern would remember the exact time because she'd been looking at her phone, calculating weather. She could slip out before midnight and still make her shift. Then the ballroom dropped into total darkness, and the music stopped, and someone nearby sucked in a sharp breath, and then the first shot cracked through the air, and the room came apart into screaming. She dropped. Muscle memory, the kind the ICU builds into you whether you want it or not. Get low, get small, don't add to the chaos. A hand found her arm in the dark and pulled firmly without apology. "Kael." "Kitchen corridor," he said against her ear, "now." She moved. He moved with her, his left hand a constant pressure at the small of her back as they pushed through the surge of bodies toward the service doors. She could hear shots in short, controlled bursts, not random, coordinated, and she understood, without having the vocabulary for this world, that this was organized, this was planned. They broke through into the service corridor, stainless steel and industrial lighting, and the smell of garlic and dishwater. Kael pulled her in, and she turned and saw him clearly for the first time in minutes. Jaw set, eyes moving rapidly, a compact black firearm already in his left hand. "You carry," she started. "Fern." Right, she had a job. She looked around, found a first aid kit mounted on the wall, grabbed it. "Where are we going?" "Loading dock. Sasha has the cars." He was already moving, his right arm held in against his side, the brace catching the light. "Stay behind me." She didn't stay behind him, exactly. She stayed beside him, which wasn't what he'd said, but was what made sense given that she could open a door faster than he could right now, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. They were 2 turns from the loading dock when the footsteps came, running, heavy, more than one. Kael pulled her through a door and shut it behind them. A narrow storage room, shelves of dry goods, a single bulb overhead. She heard him check his weapon in the dark, a one-handed manipulation that shouldn't have been possible, and clearly was. The footsteps slowed, stopped. Someone tried the handle. Fern's heart was a fist against her sternum. She grabbed a fire extinguisher off the bracket on the wall, heavy, red, solid, and positioned herself between the door and Kael. It was not a rational plan. Rationality had a way of becoming theoretical when there were people on the other side of a door. "Fern, I have the door. You have a fire extinguisher. It's all I've got." The door handle moved again. Then it slammed inward, and there were 2 of them, dark coats, blank faces, the deliberate blankness of people who had done this before, and Fern raised the extinguisher, and then an arm came around her from behind, pulling her back firmly against a solid chest. She heard 2 shots in the small room. They were enormous. Both men went down. The silence after was so complete she could hear her own pulse. She became aware of things in sequence, the extinguisher still in her grip, the solid, unmoving warmth of Kael behind her, his left arm still extended past her shoulder with the gun. His right arm, the one the whole underworld had decided was the end of him, was wrapped around her torso. The pressure of it was not weak. It was absolute. She tried to turn. His arm didn't move. "You," she managed, "could have been killed. I was standing right there. I was trying to. You were going to hit 2 armed men with a can of compressed carbon dioxide." His voice hadn't changed, still even. Still unhurried. "I had it." "Your right arm." He turned her then, one movement until she was facing him. His right hand, the one that slipped on pens, that the physio said had a 40% chance of full recovery at best, that Vasco had gestured at like a punctuation mark for everything wrong, was firm and certain at her hip. His face was very close. The single bulb above them flickered. "Do you think one hand makes me less capable, Fern?" She stared at him. The extinguisher slid out of her grip and hit the floor with a dull clang somewhere below them, and she barely heard it. "No," she said. Her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed through his expression. Not softness exactly, but the space where softness might eventually live. "Good," he said, "because Bryce set this up, and he's going to answer for it, and I need you walking out that door beside me." Sasha Rudin met them at the loading dock, compact, deliberate, a buzz cut and a white SUV idling on the ramp, and took one look at Kael's expression and made a single phone call that lasted under a minute. In the back of the car heading east on the highway, with the city glittering in the rear window, Fern finally asked, "You knew before tonight?" Kael looked out at the dark. "I knew something was moving. I didn't know the venue." "Bryce. He's been passing information to Vasco for 4 months. Since the accident," he said it without bitterness, which was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. "He decided I was the past." "Are you angry?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "I'm precise," he said, "which is different." Bryce Holland was located at his Burnaby office at 2 in the morning. Kael didn't go himself. He sent a message through channels Fern didn't have clearance to understand, and an hour later, Sasha confirmed what the message had apparently already made clear. Every man Bryce had stationed at the gala had turned, not the night before, weeks ago. Quietly, methodically, one conversation at a time, Kael had been dismantling Bryce's network with the patience of someone who never needed to be in a hurry because he already knew how it ended. Bryce had walked into a room he believed was full of his own men. Not one of them had moved. Fern heard the account from Sasha at the kitchen table of a safe house in Coquitlam and thought about Kael in the physio room with a pen, pushing against something that wouldn't push back. She thought about the arm around her in that storage room. The certainty of it. He came into the kitchen. At 4 in the morning, jacket gone, brace still on. He poured coffee left-handed with the ease of someone who'd had 8 months to adapt entirely, and asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," Fern said, "are you?" He sat across from her, set the coffee down. Then slowly he took off the brace. His right hand lay on the table between them, and he flexed the fingers. Carefully, with effort, the movement imperfect but deliberate and real. "The physio says I've recovered approximately 40% of voluntary function in the hand." He looked at it, the way he looked at everything, with an attention that was a kind of respect. "They said 60 was unlikely. I've decided not to agree with them. That's not really how medicine works. I've noticed that medicine and I have a complicated relationship." It was the closest she'd ever heard him come to a joke. It surprised a short, genuine sound out of her, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. He looked at her when she made it, and something in his expression shifted. a small and unguarded thing that she suspected very few people ever got to see. "Your brother's debt was cleared the day you arrived," he said. That was never conditional on anything. Fern went still. The 90 days were, he paused, choosing the word with the same care he gave everything, something else. She understood then what he wasn't saying, the man who could silence a room without raising his voice, who had quietly and invisibly disassembled a betrayal while the city watched him supposedly decline, was also sitting across from a nurse at 4 a.m, in a Coquitlam safe house, apparently capable of something close to uncertainty. "Something else," she repeated. "Yes. So if I chose to leave tomorrow, no one would stop you," he held her gaze. "I would not be a reasonable man about it." The distinction, she decided, made sense. Fern Westbrook did not go back to St. Paul's the next morning. She arranged her leave. She was owed it, and stayed. The weeks that followed were different from the ones before. Not loud. Kael was constitutionally incapable of loud, but fuller in some way she didn't have clinical terminology for. She kept the medical files. She sat in on meetings when invited, and watched him run the operation from the head of a table. Right arm resting, left hand managing everything with an economy of motion that the men around him had long since stopped noticing, which meant they'd accepted it as simply how things were. The consortium review Bryce had been working to manipulate never materialized. Vascu's operation suffered 2 significant losses the following month. And somewhere in the reorganization of things, a formal employment document appeared on Fern's desk one morning, without comment or announcement. The title read, Medical Director, Kael Group. She thought about correcting it. She signed it instead. They were standing on the terrace of the West Van house. One evening in late October, the city spread out below them in the particular blue gold that only Vancouver manages in autumn, when Fern said, "In that room, you held me with your right arm." Kael looked at the harbor. "Yes." Deliberately. "Yes. You could have used your left." "I could have." She waited. Somewhere below, a container ship was moving slowly through the inlet, its running lights steady in the dark. He turned to look at her, and his expression did the complicated thing she'd learned to read over months of watching him from angles he didn't always know she was using. "Do you think one hand makes me less capable?" he said quietly. Not a question this time. Something else entirely. A door being opened from the inside. "I never did," she said. "I know." He reached out, left hand, the reliable one, the one that had never needed an apology, and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that sat strangely and perfectly against everything else she knew about him. "That's why you're still here." She looked at the man the underworld had called finished, the one who had signed his name again with a damaged hand, and then, quietly and without announcement, made the world prove itself wrong about him. She thought about all the things that do not require legs or 2 working hands, or the approval of people who are watching for you to fall. She reached over and laid her hand over his right one where it rested on the railing. His fingers slowly closed around hers. Not perfectly, not without effort, but closed. They stood like that for a long while, watching the ships move through the dark water, while the city below them carried on entirely unaware of what had just been decided.